A very good morning to you all. You're watching World News and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. On Tuesday, U.S. President Donald Trump said that new Patriot missiles are already being shipped to Ukraine from Germany. The comment comes after Trump announced on Monday that the U.S. would sell weapons to NATO countries for them to then transfer the weapons to Ukraine.
When do you think the first Patriot missiles, some of these weapons that our allies will buy?
They're already being shipped.
From what countries?
They're coming in from Germany and then replaced by Germany, and in all cases, the United States gets paid back in full. So what's happening, as you know, is the European Union, if you look, mostly European Union stuff, but let's put it in the form of NATO. It's very similar. But NATO is going to pay us back for everything. In some cases, we're going to be paid back by countries of the European Union directly.
It is the aggressor who should pay, Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski said on the sidelines of the meeting of the EU Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels, commenting that the purchase of American equipment earmarked for Ukraine should not be financed by European taxpayers, but from frozen Russian assets. Poland's top diplomat, however, went on to praise Donald Trump for his decisive action against Russia and support for Ukraine.
We know that President Trump has announced that the United States will produce equipment for Ukraine. I asked my fellow ministers about who should pay for this equipment, the European taxpayers, or is it better, in my opinion, to pay for them by the aggressor with its frozen funds? Ukraine's situation is dramatic. Putin has stepped up attacks on civilian targets, and we hope that this period of 50 days before possible US sanctions enter is the period to increase pressure on the Russian Federation to finally come to its senses. I am very pleased that the President of the United States has come to those conclusions that we, as the European Union, have come to before, namely that Putin does not want peace. It is Ukraine that agrees to an unconditional ceasefire, and that the only language Putin understands is the language of pressure.
The foreign ministers of Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine are convening today in Lublin, eastern Poland. The meeting marks 5 years since the inception of the so-called Lublin Triangle. The Lublin Triangle was formed in 2020 to facilitate cooperation between Warsaw, Vilnius and Kyiv. It was also intended to become a platform of support for Ukraine's EU and NATO bid. The Lublin Triangle countries also declare their support for restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity and call for an end to Russian aggression against the country. EU ambassadors are attempting to hash out a long-awaited deal on the bloc's latest round of sanctions against Russia. A deal EU foreign ministers tried and failed to get over the line just yesterday. Joining me now with the latest is our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Good morning, Alex. So what's your assessment? Deal or no deal?
Well, no deal so far, Claudio. No white smoke above the European Council building behind me. We've been waiting nearly 2 months since these sanctions were proposed. Initially, there was an objection from Hungary and Slovakia. Now it was Slovakia and Malta. Not concerned about Malta, at least Kaja Kallas wasn't yesterday. Slovakia remains the sticking point. Let's remind ourselves what is in these proposed sanctions: a complete ban on the use of the Nord Stream pipelines, an oil price cap down from $60 to 45, a dramatic drop, in fact, because that price cap was never triggered in the time that it was applied. An additional 77 tankers added to the sanctions in Russia's shadow fleet, a ban on refined oil coming from Russia into the European Union, even going through third-party countries. So quite a comprehensive set of sanctions, including more sanctions on Russian banks, on other financial institutions, etc. But Slovakia remains that thorn in the EU side. We heard from Kaja Kallas just yesterday saying she was sad that they could not have a political agreement between the foreign ministers yesterday, saying that the Commission had delivered everything that Slovakia had asked for, and now Slovakia seems to be moving the goalpost. The request from Robert Fico, the Slovak Prime Minister, is that his country is exempted from the complete phase-out of Russian fossil fuels that the rest of the EU will apply, and allowed to honour its contracts with the Russian energy giant Gazprom until 2034. Now, of course, for European diplomats who are trying to reduce Russia's ability to finance its invasion of Ukraine, reduce its ability to finance the strikes on civilian targets in Ukraine, as we've seen in the last few days, the idea of letting Slovakia pay more money into the Russian treasury seems very, very contradictory indeed. For now, the EU ambassadors are in the room trying to hash out a deal, trying to get this over the line. Claudia.
Thank you so much. That was Alex Kadir reporting live from Brussels. As both the EU and the US are pushing for further sanctions on Russia, which continue to avoid peace negotiations, the markets in Moscow have responded positively to threats from Washington and Brussels. Kinga Redłowska of the Royal United Services Institute Europe says the threat of direct Trump tariffs wouldn't impact Russia too much, but secondary sanctions on countries which trade with Russia could impact Moscow greatly.
So it's very difficult to comment definitively on Donald Trump's stance, as it tends to shift often and significantly. But what President Trump announced yesterday is that if Russia doesn't sit at the negotiation table within the next 50 days, the US will impose severe economic measures on Russia to restrict the revenue Kremlin is generating to wage the illegal war. But when we look closely into the specifics of what President Trump announced and what was later explained by the White House officials, because President Trump coined a new term, secondary tariffs, so later White House officials explained that what he meant actually is that the US will impose tariffs on Russia, which actually is a tool of a relatively low impact, because actually Russia-US trade is relatively low. But he also announced that he would impose tariffs, or as later explained, secondary sanctions on countries and entities that buy Russian oil, Russian energy, and Russian minerals. And that could hit hard. It actually, if President Trump follows through, can be a seismic shift in terms of global energy market.
For Donald Trump, this is personal, said Scott Lucas, professor of American Studies at University College Dublin, describing the U.S. president's recent decision to impose a 50-day ultimatum on Russia or face increased sanctions.
For Donald Trump, this is personal. He's frustrated with Vladimir Putin because Trump's vision was that he could end this Russian invasion, albeit pretty much by accepting the Kremlin's conditions, but then he could get the Nobel Peace Prize and get all the glory that he seeks each and every day. The problem with those tactics is that Vladimir Putin doesn't want to make any compromise or any concessions to give Trump that Nobel Peace Prize. So not only have Russia refused to compromise by accepting a ceasefire, they've been expanding their missile and drone attacks. These are now record-setting attacks, most of them on Ukraine civilians. And there's no easing of the demands that Russia be able to seize 20% of Ukraine, that it be able to keep Ukraine weak and demilitarized, that sanctions are lifted on Moscow, and even that the Zelensky government be pushed out of power. So with no prospect of a resolution, Trump gets angry. And then you have this decision he makes, all right, we will begin to provide weapons to Ukraine.
Russia continued its attacks on Ukraine overnight. Drones and missiles fired by the Kremlin reached not only the eastern regions of the country, but also the capital, Kyiv, as well as several cities in the west, far from the front line. Numerous people are reported injured after these mass attacks, with at least 8 hospitalized in the Vytsynia region in central Ukraine. The continued Russian onslaught comes amid Trump issuing a 50-day deadline ultimatum to Vladimir Putin to end the war. The U.S. also announced it will bolster military support to Ukraine, supplying it with more anti-missile systems. The latest increasingly intense Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilians show just how little Moscow is committed to building peace, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has said. While talking about Russia, Meloni noted that unlike Moscow, Kyiv accepted the proposal of an unconditional ceasefire.
As you know, Ukraine has repeatedly accepted an unconditional ceasefire and has expressed its willingness to sit at the negotiating table. On the other side, however, we continue to see no progress. In fact, Russia continues to strike civilians, attacks that are increasingly intense and brutal, showing just how little Moscow is committed to building the peace we are all striving for. And this is despite the Trump administration's willingness to engage in dialogue, which Putin has chosen to reject. Today, we are seeing a shift in the U.S. position, and we welcome it positively.
An American who secretly provided intelligence to the Russian military from inside Ukraine has been granted Russian citizenship. According to a Russian military commander, information provided by Daniel Martindale helps Russian forces plan an offensive to seize Kharkov, a town near the logistic hub of Pokrovsk.
The citizenship ceremony for Daniel Richard Martindale was widely broadcasted on state-owned media. According to Russian media, he was granted citizenship by order of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Martindale first arrived in Russia in 2018 to study the language and teach English in the Far East city of Vladivostok. In the February 2022, just before the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Martindale relocated to Poland and crossed into Ukraine. He then traveled eastwards to the Donetsk region, eventually settling in a Ukrainian village. Over the next 2 years, Martindale covertly shared intelligence with the Russian military, including information on Ukrainian troop positions.
A new Finnish law banning Russian and Belarusian citizens from purchasing real estate in the country took effect on July 15th. The move is part of a broader effort by authorities in Helsinki to bolster Finland's national security amid Russia's increasingly aggressive attitude towards the region. The introduction of the new measure was announced on social media by the Finnish Defense Minister Antti Häkkänen. The new law allows the Ministry of Defense to block property transactions involving nationals from countries considered a potential security threat. Under the law, officials in Helsinki identified Russia and Belarus as the countries to which the regulation applies. Previously, Finnish authorities could only block property purchases by Russian citizens on a case-by-case basis. The new law simplifies that process by introducing a blanket prohibition. Billionaire Czech politician and former prime minister of the country, Andrej Babiš, said he would scrap a Prague-led initiative to supply Ukraine with large-caliber ammunition if he returns to power. Babiš is the leader of the right-wing ANO party, which currently leads in the polls ahead of a general election in October.
So, the ammunition initiative, you said it was overpriced. Yes, rotten. Rotten? So you're going to scrap it then? Well, of course. Why would we continue with that? We need money for our people. We need money for... So we're just completely wasting it with our allies. Our role in this is organizational. No. It's not working out. And we want to know how much the Czech Republic paid. It's all kept completely secret. We will invest in our country's defensive capabilities. Yes, defensive capabilities, right? That means anti-missile systems, Patriot missiles, not those overpriced F-35s that the Prime Minister bought just to get a backdoor entry into the White House when nobody was expecting him and then talked about Ukraine. Well, I don't know the specifics of that contract, but why would we sign such a contract for planes that won't arrive for 10 years?
The latest global ranking of the least livable cities in the world has been released, with some cities still struggling due to ongoing conflicts, political instability and poor infrastructure. Among the 10 cities at the top of the list is Kyiv, which remains heavily impacted by war. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit's Global Livability Index for 2025, the 10 least livable cities are ranked based on several factors, including stability, healthcare, education, culture, and infrastructure. The bottom-ranked city is Damascus, Syria, still suffering from the aftermath of a devastating decade-long civil war. Kyiv, Ukraine's capital, is also in the worst 10 with a livability score of 44.5, while the average is around 75 on the scale. The ongoing war with Russia has severely affected the city's infrastructure and safety, making it one of the least livable cities in Europe. Other cities in the list include Caracas in Venezuela, Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, and Tripoli in Libya. The global picture is grim, with many cities from the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia facing similar challenges. And so this marks the end of our news service. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Klaudia Czerwinska, and I do hope to see you back here on TVP World in just a moment for more news and features.